William.
Thank you very much. And thanks to Liz and Urendra for your comments. And I think Urendra was talking about the origins of Aid for Trade and where it all came from. And in a way, I think a lot of this discussion reflects a discussion we've been having for some time in the Aid for Trade community. But a lot has changed since 2006. And when I listen to Liz, I hear a lot of pretty standard prescriptions about more evaluation, more accountability, transparency, realistic assumption, and strengthening the evidence base. And none of us are really against that. But also, I think you mentioned the way you teed up those recommendations was to say that there's a lack of clarity in identifying the results chains. It's difficult to specify counterfactuals in trade. There's a lot of other factors influencing trade. And donor agencies are almost always face limited resources and deficiency in technical capacity. And plus, in the aid discussions, is a move towards less looking at narrow donor accountability and getting a sense of what donor interventions do, and more of turning it around and looking at development strategies of developing countries and having country-owned and country-based results framework, and then seeing where the donor fits into that and how the donor can help the developing country achieve the results that it's looking for. So in a way, the paper seemed to me a little bit dated in its emphasis on donor programming, especially since, as Urendra also mentioned, the global debate is really moving beyond ODA in the discussion at the WTO. Whether that's a good or bad thing, I leave to others to determine. And I think this makes sense if we're talking about the global community and we're talking about aid for trade writ large. If we're talking about building trade capacities in middle-income countries, it's a very different discussion than low-income countries, and it requires very different instruments. So ODA, yes, makes sense for LDCs and low-income countries, but increasingly we need to look at a broader spectrum of development finance flows and instruments while keeping in mind what activities are generally funded and where. For example, other official flows or non-concessional lending mostly provided by multilaterals, only about 2% of that goes to low-income countries. So it's not necessarily the right instrument for aid for trade in general. In terms of the debate on evaluation, again, I think there's been some progress. At the OECD, we've tried to, in the past, document how donors are approaching this issue. And we've had a few national strategy reviews of aid for trade programs, and then there's all the gambit of projects that you classify under aid for trade that have been undertaken in the last few years. And for some donors, particularly smaller ones, it's very basic evaluation to satisfy accountability. Was the money spent, and did it go where it was meant to go? Very little discussion of outcomes and impacts. For other donors, particularly the multilaterals, it's a slightly more savvy discussion. And the World Bank has led the discussion on impact evaluation, in particular the application of randomized control trials to trade. And Olivia Cadeau and others in the World Bank Gene Pool have written a book on where to spend the next million in trade-related assistance. And that's very interesting work. Again, I think you need to look at the instruments. It's not necessarily all ODA-funded projects. If you're providing assistance to firms, then it's easier to specify a treatment group and a control group. So these impact evaluation methods are more amenable to other instruments than ODA, which generally tends to finance business environments and infrastructure and broader issues which are difficult to assess the specific impacts of those things. The limitations, of course, of impact assessment, generally it's a good idea. It helps address some of the conceptual challenges that exist in trade-related assistance, and the bank has argued that it's not really conceptual issues which are the key impediment to strengthening evaluation. It's actually more the incentive issues, which you kind of hinted at when you talked about the time horizon of a project manager and evaluation. But impact evaluations are costly, they're burdensome, lengthy, and not necessarily aligned with the project manager's incentives. But they do, I think, help get across this idea that we should prioritize learning over accountability. and you should choose an impact evaluation based on what you can learn from the study. But again, if we're looking at trade-related interventions, I think getting at the poverty impacts of those is going to be a little bit problematic. It would probably involve a household survey, which with the baseline and final survey for 500 households, that costs about $300,000. So most activities are off the table straight away for trade-related activities, which generally, the narrow definition of ape trade is generally quite low-cost projects. If we look at trade facilitation, the cost of implementation of customs reforms, things like that is quite small, whereas the benefits are quite large. So it may not work. Of course, also in the trade-related assistance evaluation, you're mostly looking at impacts at the firm level. So again, getting at the poverty impacts in those studies is going to be quite challenging. So I think that's where the debate currently is, more straightforward methods versus impact evaluation. The OECD and the WTO are more focused on these results-based management frameworks and how to improve the management of aid and other resources for trade and development results and what indicators make sense. And our view of the world is consistent with what Yurendra was saying, that we look at direct, intermediate, and final impacts, and generally poverty is a final impact, but we see the interventions more as having a direct bearing on the direct impacts. So, for example, clearance times at customs, transport costs, and times, and things like that are the more direct things that we focus on. And at the next global review, again, in keeping with this narrative of how the trade discussion and the development discussion is changing, we're going to focus more at value chains and how developing countries connect to value chains. And we already see some poor developing countries connecting in very interesting ways in agricultural services and goods supply chains. For example, Cambodia and Samoa are involved in motorcycle and car part assembly. And a lot of other developing countries are starting to move up the value chain. And this discussion is quite removed from the poverty focus, and I think that's why this study is useful and important, because although we are moving to a focus on value chains and the private sector and a stronger partnership between donors and the private sector, it's important to focus on other considerations, and poverty being chief among them. And also, at the global review, we will have a sectoral focus for the first time. Look at agro-foods, textiles, ICT, transport and logistics, each of which have very different potential growth and poverty dynamics. So going more to that discussion and looking at the private sector and what activities they're undertaking, I think will add a dimension to the aid for trade debate in general. And the novel part of the next global review will be a private sector questionnaire, and there we've solicited the views of 700 firms across 120 countries. And what emerges from what firms are saying about this issue of trade capacity building is generally not that surprising. The main constraints are lack of access to finance. Trade facilitation comes out quite strongly. Labor, training, skills comes out in certain sectors like ICT and tourism. And then obviously the business environment also is quite important. So the business, in closing, I think in aid for trade we're increasingly making the business case for aid for trade, but there's still a very important role and room for socioeconomic upgrading and poverty in that discussion.
Thank you very much, William.